The Smoky Mountains of Tennessee carried a heavy fog that October morning, the kind that seemed to swallow sound and light in equal measure. The tourists who gathered at the small ranger station in Gatlinburg adjusted their jackets and scarves, shifting from foot to keep warm on the chilled ground. Among them stood Jason Mitchell, a 29-year-old guide with sunburned cheeks and a battered notebook tucked in his back pocket. He had been the one to propose this off-season hike, telling the group they would see a side of the Smokies most visitors missed. The air smelled of damp earth and pine needles crushed under boots as they set off Jason, talking freely about Cherokee legends and Civil War skirmishes in the valleys they now threaded through. His voice had a calm certainty to it that made people lean in to catch each word, trusting him with their day and their safety. By mid-morning, the trail narrowed to a bend where the fog seemed even thicker, curling around tree trunks like ghostly ropes. Jason stopped, held up a gloved hand, and announced there was an unmarked path he knew. It led to what he called a secret overlook, a view no standard tour offered. Murmurs of excitement passed through the group. Some adjusted camera straps and exchanged knowing looks, eager to share a photo no one else had. Jason turned on his heel with practiced confidence and led them into underbrush that rustled with the hiss of dead leaves. The tourists followed single file, their boots leaving deep impressions in the loamy soil. The air grew colder as they climbed, and the usual banter of vacationers turned to silence, broken only by the scrape of branches and labored breathing. About 30 minutes later, the path ended abruptly in a clearing. Trees bent overhead like cathedral arches, the canopy swallowing much of the weak autumn light. Jason dropped his pack against a fallen log and stretched his back. He swept an arm toward the shrouded valley below, describing ridgelines that on clear days stretched blue all the way to Carolina. The group gathered in a rough circle, listening to his story about settlers who once built hidden stills here. They laughed politely, took photos, and compared snacks from their day packs. Then Jason announced he needed to check a side trail for safety. He would be gone 5 minutes at most. He turned and walked into the trees, the hem of his faded canvas coat disappearing into a wall of gray. The moment he left, the mood changed in a way that was subtle but undeniable. One of the older men glanced at his watch, muttering that 5 minutes had come and gone. A woman tried calling Jason's name, but her voice was swallowed by the fog. A few uneasy jokes about getting lost flickered and died on dry lips. The woods felt closer now, the silence between the trees deepening into something oppressive. Someone noticed Jason's pack leaning forgotten on the log and pointed at it with a frown. It was unzipped, the top flopped open in a careless way that seemed out of character for their meticulous guide. The tourists began to shift their weight boots, grinding into dirt as they debated what to do. Another 15 minutes passed. Two of the younger men decided to retrace the path Jason had taken. They left wordlessly, the underbrush crackling under their boots as they vanished into the thick fog. The others waited in the clearing, arms wrapped around themselves for warmth. No one wanted to admit out loud that they were frightened, but the tension was unmistakable. The woman, who had been the first to call out, now stared at Jason's abandoned backpack as though it were an accusation. A middle-aged couple argued in low voices about whether to call the authorities or wait longer. In the distance, the cries of the two men faded into the hush of the trees. It took another 20 minutes before one of the scouts returned alone, his face pale and drawn. He said he had not found any trace of Jason, no sign of footprints past a certain point. The group erupted in whispered fear. Some refused to go any further, while others insisted they all needed to look. Cell service was spotty this deep in the park, but they tried frantically to get a signal. At last, one phone managed a crackling 911 call, the voice on the other end warping and dropping out, but clear enough to send help. The ranger station was miles away, and the sun was starting its slow descent behind the clouded ridgelines, taking what little warmth remained with it. While they waited, the fog began to thicken so that they could barely see each other. People clutched their packs and moved closer together for warmth and safety, their breaths emerging in pale white plumes. The sounds of the forest seemed to grow sharper, every cracking twig and distant animal call setting nerves on edge. When they heard the first barking of search dogs and the calls of rescuers, they nearly wept with relief. But that relief turned to dread when the first rangers arrived, scanned the clearing with grim professionalism, and asked them to start from the beginning. Their questions were methodical. What had Jason said? Where exactly had he gone? Did he seem upset or scared? The group tried to answer, but their stories tangled. One man swore Jason had looked nervous before he left, as if he had heard something in the woods. Another insisted he had seemed perfectly normal, cracking jokes about boot prints. A young woman broke down crying when she admitted she had not really been paying attention at all. The rescuers frowned, taking notes under the harsh beam of LED headlamps. Jason's backpack was examined, its contents shaken out onto the cold dirt. Inside were a map, a flashlight with dying batteries, a crushed energy bar, and a battered field notebook with scribbles about local history. Nothing that explained why their guide had walked away from them and disappeared without a sound. As the rangers organized search grids and gave the tourists water and space blankets, the clearing became a staging area for growing panic. Radios crackled with clipped commands, and the search dogs circled restlessly, whining at the edge of the trees. By midnight, the tourists were being escorted back down the trail under guard. A medic checked their vitals, clapped shaking shoulders, and tried to calm them. Jason was still missing. The last place he had been seen was a stretch of dense woods without so much as a game trail beyond it. As they left the clearing behind, one of the tourists turned to look back. Jason's abandoned backpack lay on the log, moonlight catching the dull canvas, looking for all the world like someone still sitting there waiting patiently to finish the tour. By the time they reached the ranger station, news had spread. Locals with ATVs and spotlights offered help. Jason's mother arrived at dawn in a borrowed truck, clutching a photo of her son in his park uniform. The photo was passed from hand to hand, lit by trembling flashlights. Search maps spread across the wooden counter, and the station's front room coffee cups lined up like soldiers. The tourists huddled together under scratchy blankets, their eyes wide and wet. Outside, the fog began to lift, revealing a forest that looked normal again. But everyone knew that something was very wrong. Jason Mitchell was gone. He had simply walked away, and in the 12 hours since, no one had seen a single sign of him. The hours following Jason Mitchell's disappearance unfolded with grim inevitability as the fog lifted just enough to reveal the scale of the crisis. Rangers, volunteers, and local deputies formed a hasty search party that morning, combing the narrow trail and radiating into the woods with practiced efficiency. Radios crackled with status updates as men and women called Jason's name into the cold air, their voices carrying but meeting no reply except the rustle of wind through dead leaves. The tourists who had been on the tour were interviewed in small groups on the ranger station's sagging porch, their eyes bloodshot from lack of sleep and terror. Each described the moment Jason walked off with slight variations, small discrepancies that deepened the unease. Some swore he had seemed in good spirits, while others insisted they had seen a flash of worry in his eyes before he turned away. By mid-morning, the local sheriff arrived in a battered SUV boots, crunching on gravel as he surveyed the volunteers and the search maps spread on the station counter. He was an older man with gray hair at his temples and a reputation for patience, but today his eyes were tight with concern. He assigned deputies to interview the tourists again, pressing them gently but firmly for any hint of what Jason might have said. A young couple who had been near the front of the line remembered a fleeting moment when Jason had seemed distracted, glancing over his shoulder into the trees as if he had heard something. Another tourist insisted she had heard Jason mutter about checking the trail for safety, nothing more. The sheriff frowned as he recorded the details in his notebook, the tension in the room tightening with each conflicting account. Outside, in the cold clearing where Jason's pack had been found, a small group of volunteers paused their search to gather around it once more. They sifted through the contents slowly, hoping for a missed clue. The map was creased and stained, marked with loops and notes in Jason's cramped handwriting. A few of the routes were well-known trails, but there was one jagged line drawn in red ink that simply ended with a question mark. No one could make sense of it, though the rangers kept returning to it, running fingers over the faded paper as if they might divine its meaning. The flashlight, dead and rattling when shaken, was pocketed as potential evidence. The air around them felt heavy and close, despite the open space, and even the dogs whined uneasily, noses to the ground, without picking up a strong scent. As the day wore on, word spread through the small town of Gatlinburg that the guide had gone missing with no trace. Locals who knew Jason described him as steady, reliable, and far too experienced to simply wander off. By afternoon, a line of trucks and old SUVs filled with volunteers snaked along the narrow park roads, headlights on in the gray light. Men with bright orange hats and reflective vests unloaded gear, checking radios and GPS units with the brisk competence born of countless past searches for lost hikers. But those had usually ended with relief or tragedy within hours. This felt different. Some of the older volunteers exchanged worried glances, muttering that the woods felt wrong today, too quiet in a way that set their teeth on edge. The tourists who had returned to town were put up in a local inn that doubled as an emergency staging area. They sat in the lobby, clutching paper cups of coffee, their conversation stilted and full of tension. Some cried openly. Others stared at their phones, willing them to work, despite the spotty mountain signal. One man, who had been closest to Jason when he announced the side trail, insisted he had heard something in the trees, a crack like a breaking branch, right before the guide disappeared. But when pressed by deputies, his confidence faltered, and he admitted he might have imagined it. Another woman insisted she had heard Jason calling for help far away, but no one else corroborated her claim. Over and over, the investigators asked for details, and over the tourists contradicted one another or fell silent. At dusk, the sheriff called the search to halt for the night, citing safety concerns. The mountains turned black and formless as the last orange glow of sunset bled away, leaving the searchers to pack their gear in weary silence. Flashlights swept over the tangled undergrowth, illuminating nothing but the skeletal trees and the silver breath of men and women talking in low tones. In the ranger station, a few stayed behind to pore over topographic maps under harsh fluorescent lights, marking off the areas already searched and debating where to concentrate efforts the next morning. There was no sign of Jason, no evidence he had even left the small clearing where his pack had been found. Back in town, Jason's mother sat at a table in the corner of the inn's dining room, staring at her son's photograph in her shaking hands. She had refused to leave when offered a hotel room, insisting on being close to the search. A local pastor sat beside her, quietly offering comfort that felt hollow in the chill silence. Outside the window, search trucks rumbled down Main Street, headlights stabbing through the dark. Shopkeepers who had closed early to join the search unlocked their doors to hand out hot drinks and blankets to anyone who needed them. Conversations in town lowered to anxious whispers. Everyone seemed to agree on one thing. Jason Mitchell had known these woods better than most. If he had gotten lost, it made no sense. When the sheriff finally stepped out of the ranger station and walked over to the inn to speak to the family and the gathered volunteers, his face was lined with worry. He explained in a low voice that they would regroup in the morning with fresh teams and dogs. He would call in state resources if necessary. But for tonight, everyone had to rest, even if they did not want to. The words settled over the crowd like a shroud. People nodded slowly, some hugging each other, others wrapping arms around themselves against the creeping cold. In the silence that followed, the wind rattled the inn's old sign out front, the sound carrying far into the empty street. By midnight, Gatlinburg was quiet, but not peaceful. In homes, motels, and the ranger station, people lay awake listening to the wind in the trees and the distant sound of dogs barking restlessly. The woods that had drawn so many tourists each year with promises of beauty and adventure now felt like something darker, a maze that had swallowed one of their own. Radios on nightstands crackled with search updates. Volunteers slept in shifts on borrowed cots. In the darkened lobby of the inn, the tourists sat together, unable to sleep, jumping at every sound outside. They shared theories in hushed voices. Some suggested Jason had fallen. Others whispered of robbery or worse. but no one could explain how he had simply vanished in front of them without leaving so much as a broken branch behind. At the end of that long, cold day, the truth was grim and undeniable. Jason Mitchell was missing. He had led a group of trusting tourists into the fog and then walked away, leaving behind only his pack and a dozen terrified witnesses who could not agree on what had really happened. The authorities were determined to find him alive or dead, but the mountain seemed just as determined to hold its secret. As night fell, searchers and townspeople alike were forced to admit the unthinkable. Jason Mitchell had vanished, and no one knew how to bring him back. Morning in the Smoky Mountains broke cold and grim with frost limbing every branch in brittle white. Volunteers gathered before dawn at the ranger station, their breath fogging in the air as they loaded packs with thermoses and first aid kits. Inside the cramped station, the sheriff addressed them in a weary voice, outlining the new grid system for the search. Maps were spread over old wooden counters, corners held down with rocks and coffee mugs. Everyone listened carefully but with growing dread. The day before had produced nothing except Jason's abandoned pack and the growing sense that the forest itself wanted to swallow him whole. They had covered the most obvious paths already, so today they would push into rougher ground. Out on the trails, the searchers moved slowly, calling Jason's name until their voices cracked with cold. Dogs strained at their leashes' noses, skimming the ground without conviction. A veteran tracker led one group down a narrow ravine, examining the mud for footprints but finding nothing except deer tracks. Another team picked through dense laurel thickets, cursing softly as branches clawed at jackets. Radios sputtered with check-ins every hour, terse and clipped. Even the most experienced rangers admitted quietly that the terrain was uncooperative, full of gullies and hidden hollows that could conceal anything. Despite this, no sign of Jason appeared. Not a dropped glove, not a scrap of fabric. Back at the ranger station, tension simmered. The sheriff met with deputies and rangers around the coffee-stained table, voices low but urgent. They discussed weather reports that warned of rain that afternoon, which would complicate everything. Equipment failures slowed the effort. One ATV had to be abandoned with a busted axle, leaving searchers to hike the last mile on foot. Cell coverage failed repeatedly, so runners were sent to relay messages. As noon approached, the search grid fell into disarray with teams doubling back over their own paths. Frustration flared. Two volunteers argued bitterly over which ridge they had already covered, their voices harsh enough to make nearby tourists flinch. Meanwhile, Jason's mother refused to leave the ranger station. She sat stiff-backed in an old wooden chair by the window, watching searchers come and go. She clutched a faded photo of Jason in his ranger uniform, its edges worn to soft fuzz. When a deputy offered her coffee, she shook her head without speaking. At intervals, she would stand and press her palms to the glass, peering out as if she could will her son to walk up the path. The sheriff checked on her twice, his voice hushed and measured. She listened to his updates without expression. Each time he returned to the search map, his shoulders seemed to sag a little lower. The tourists who had been on Jason's tour were now being kept in town, instructed not to leave while the investigation continued. Some had rented cars and threatened to drive home, but deputies persuaded them to stay, promising they were not suspects but witnesses. They sat in the lobby of the inn, picking at vending machine snacks and watching the local news cover the search. A reporter interviewed one of them on the porch, the camera lens glinting in the dull light. The man spoke haltingly about Jason's disappearance, his voice cracking as he described the moment Jason vanished into the trees. Other tourists refused interviews altogether, shielding their faces from the camera with raised hands. By late afternoon, cold rain swept in from the west, turning the ground to slick, treacherous mud. Searchers slipped on rocks and cursed under their breath. Dogs shivered under wet fur, refusing to go forward in places where the footing was too unstable. Radios filled with terse calls to regroup. At one point, a deputy slipped and twisted his ankle, forcing two men to carry him out with a makeshift stretcher of jackets and branches. When they reached the trailhead, headlights from waiting trucks cast long shadows across the muddy path, illuminating their grim faces. Volunteers returned one by one, soaked and defeated, shaking their heads at the waiting deputies. Inside the ranger station, the mood was leaden. Wet jackets dripped onto the floor puddles spreading across cracked linoleum. A heater rattled in the corner but gave off little warmth. The sheriff stood at the map for a long time, marker in hand, but not writing anything. A park ranger, a woman with 30 years of experience in these woods, spoke softly to him about the possibility they had missed a ravine or an old mining cut. He shook his head, slowly, eyes red-rimmed with exhaustion. The maps seemed to mock them with their neat grid lines. Outside, rain lashed the old windows, filling the silence with its relentless patter. As darkness fell, the search was suspended for the second night in a row. Trucks and SUVs rumbled down the mountain roads, headlights cutting through sheets of rain. Some volunteers sat silent in the back seats, their boots caked with mud, while others spoke in low, urgent tones about trying again at first light. In town, the inn's lobby was quiet, except for the hiss of the gas fireplace and the crackle of the local news on the TV. The reporter described the ongoing search in solemn tones, her hair plastered to her face with rain. The camera panned across rows of soaked volunteers returning to the station, their faces pale and hollow-eyed. Jason's mother was offered a room in the back of the ranger station, but she refused. She chose to sit in the darkened lobby with a single lamp burning beside her. She ran her fingers over the edges of Jason's photo again and again. Occasionally, she would murmur words no one else could hear. The sheriff came over and sat beside her for a while without speaking. He simply placed his wide-worn hand on the table and left it there, offering the only comfort he could. In the silence, the old building creaked and shifted around them, the wind rattling the shutters in fits and starts. By midnight, the rain had slowed to a dismal drizzle, soaking the town until it felt like the sky itself was weeping. Inside the ranger station, the last of the volunteers drifted out to their trucks, promising to return at dawn. The sheriff watched them go before closing the door and leaning heavily against it. He turned off the overhead light, leaving only the small lamp by Jason's mother to push back the gloom. Outside, the wind gusted, sending cold drafts through the old wooden walls. The search had found nothing. No trail, no clue, no answer. Jason Mitchell had disappeared as completely as if the earth itself had swallowed him whole. The rain eased overnight, leaving the Smoky Mountains under a damp, sagging sky. By morning, the roads were lined with puddles that reflected the gray gloom overhead. Volunteers gathered once more at the ranger station, their faces lined with fatigue and something darker, a creeping hopelessness they tried to hide. The sheriff called for a briefing just after sunrise. He spoke in a steady voice about new sectors to be searched and the need for methodical work, but everyone in the room felt the truth pressing in on them. They had scoured the easy ground. They had found nothing. As he spoke, his finger moved over the map to areas marked with red X's and circles, but even he did not sound convinced they would find anything new. Outside, small groups of locals traded theories in low voices that grew sharper as frustration mounted. Some blamed Jason himself, muttering that he must have wanted to disappear. Others scoffed at that idea, saying he would never leave his mother to suffer this way. A pair of old hikers argued quietly on the ranger station porch, one insisting Jason must have fallen into an abandoned mine shaft, while the other said there were no open shafts left in that sector. Theories spread like ripples in a pond. A retired deputy suggested he might have run afoul of poachers, while a volunteer shook his head and said the poachers knew better than to leave witnesses. Each idea brought new anxiety, new anger, and no real answers. Word spread of a man in town who claimed he had seen Jason talking to a stranger in camouflage the day before the hike. Deputies interviewed him at the diner where he worked the grill. He spoke in uncertain tones about a tall man with a beard and a green hunting jacket. He could not remember details about the face. He admitted freely that he had only seen them from the back while he cleaned the counter. The sheriff wrote it all down anyway, lips pressed thin with worry. He sent a deputy to canvass the few local cabins and seasonal campsites, but no one admitted to seeing anyone suspicious. The stranger in camouflage became just another ghost in the trees, another rumor that spread through Gatlinburg in uneasy whispers. Back in town, Jason's mother was moved to a local church at the suggestion of the pastor who promised her privacy and warmth. She sat in a small room lined with hymnals and fading photographs of baptisms, her hands wrapped around a paper cup of tea she did not drink. Visitors came in ones and twos, offering food she could not eat and words she could not hear. Outside the window, the steeple cast a long shadow over the parking lot, the wet pavement gleaming under shifting clouds. The pastor checked on her every hour, speaking gently about hope and faith, but his words fell flat in the thick, heavy air of waiting and dread. In the ranger station, deputies worked the phones with tired voices following up on tips that led nowhere. One caller insisted she had heard Jason's name on a CB radio while driving through the park, but when pressed, she could not remember the frequency. Another man claimed he had seen Jason walking along the highway in the early hours after the search began, but his story changed each time he told it. A frustrated deputy slammed down the receiver and rubbed his temples, staring at the mess of notes piling up in front of him. The sheriff walked through the station, slowly listening to the half-finished reports, his jaw tight as he tried to keep the chaos under control. As the day wore on, the tourists who had been on Jason's tour were once again called in for interviews. They sat in a small meeting room at the inn, folding their hands around paper cups of stale coffee. A deputy read their statements back to them line by line, looking for any crack or inconsistency. Some grew defensive, insisting they had told everything already. Others began to doubt their own memories, hesitating when asked exactly where Jason had stepped off the trail. One woman trembled when she admitted she'd not been watching him at all, too busy taking photos of the foggy trees. Another man rubbed his eyes and said he could not shake the feeling that Jason had heard something in the woods, something that made him turn away from the group. Rumors sown seeped from the inn into the streets of Gatlinburg, spreading through diners, gas stations, and church lobbies. Some locals whispered that Jason had debts he could not pay, that he had staged his own disappearance to escape them. Others scoffed at the idea, insisting he loved his job too much that he would never leave his mother behind. A few darker theories surfaced, spoken in hushed tones by those who remembered old stories about drifters who sometimes camped in the park, illegally, people desperate enough to do anything for cash or food. None of it could be proven, but that did not stop the talk. It filled the spaces left by uncertainty, offering comfort in its own cruel way by pretending there might be an answer, even a monstrous one. By dusk, the sheriff stood outside the ranger station watching the last volunteers head home for the night. He leaned against the railing, arms crossed, hat low over his brow. The wind tugged at his coat, carrying the smell of wet leaves and wood smoke from town. He listened to the radio crackle with static, the dispatcher reading off the final check-ins for the evening. He closed his eyes for a moment, feeling the weight of the silence that followed. He did not want to go inside and look at the search maps again. He did not want to call Jason's mother one more time to tell her there was no news. He stayed there until the cold drove him in the station door creaking shut behind him. That night in town, lights burned late in the diner and the church. Locals sat over mugs of coffee, gone cold, voices low, heads shaking. The pastor locked the front door carefully before turning off the sanctuary lights. At the inn, the tourists lay awake in their rooms, staring at the stained ceilings, replaying every moment of that foggy hike. In the ranger station, the sheriff sat at the counter with a mug that steamed in the cold room, reading over the notes he had written all day. He picked up the photo of Jason that sat by the radio, the corners curled and worn, and he set it down again with trembling fingers. Days turned to weeks with no sign of Jason Mitchell. The search operation slowly thinned as volunteers returned to work and school, their boots and jackets drying in garages, mud and pine needles still clinging to them like ghosts of that grim effort. The sheriff continued to authorize small search teams, sending 2 or 3 rangers at a time to check side trails, abandoned cabins, and even creek beds that had swelled with autumn rains. Each day brought fewer people willing to go back into the woods, the early momentum of the search sapped by exhaustion, and the sour certainty that they were no longer looking for someone to save, but someone to bury. Radios crackled with routine check-ins, but little urgency. Even the dogs seemed less eager, picking at the trail half-heartedly, tails low, as the handlers called Jason's name into an empty forest. At the ranger station, the large map that had been so carefully marked and updated was left to yellow and curl at the edges. It still hung on the wall, a silent accusation of all they had failed to find. Coffee cups gathered in careless rings on counters, conversations lost their fire and urgency. Deputies sat with clipboards and forms, but rarely filled them out. The sheriff tried to keep his team motivated, rotating shifts, encouraging volunteers with stiff smiles, but every day ended the same way with nothing new to report. Even the tourists were finally allowed to leave town. They left in small groups, paying their bills at the inn with quiet relief and avoiding eye contact with locals who regarded them with a mix of pity and suspicion. In Gatlinburg itself, the story of Jason's disappearance took on the shape of a local tragedy, the sort of thing mentioned in hushed voices over bar counters or murmured as warnings to children who wandered too far into the woods. Flyers with his face still clung to corkboards in gas stations and grocery stores, their edges soft from rain and handling. The photograph showed a smiling man in ranger green, his eyes bright, the sort of image that made people shake their heads and mutter that he had always seemed too young for this to happen. At the church, where his mother stayed most nights, candles were kept lit in the small alcove to the side of the main room. Parishioners came by to leave notes and cards for her, and she read them all in silence, eyes dry and distant. Deputies followed up on the last straggling tips, though no one expected anything from them. A rumor of a campsite with strange men turned out to be a family from Kentucky who showed their IDs with shaking hands. A reported scream in the woods proved to be a bobcat. A footprint found on a muddy slope was measured and deemed too small to be Jason's. The local news ran a final story with soft piano music over photos of the search volunteers and Jason himself. The anchor finished the segment with quiet sympathy, saying only that the search had been suspended pending new leads. After that, even the press stopped calling. At the ranger station, Jason's personal locker was cleaned out in an awkward, quiet moment by one of his colleagues. It held a worn jacket, a set of neatly folded maps, and a battered thermos with his name scratched into the side. The sheriff watched from his office door without a word, then turned away to stare at the window where frost was beginning to form in the corners. The days were growing shorter, the light falling away faster and faster, leaving the mountains dark and unwelcoming by late afternoon. The locals knew winter would come quickly this year, closing off most of the high trails entirely. It would be months before anyone could even try to look again. Jason's mother refused to leave town even then. She moved from the church to a rented room above the diner, paying weekly and wrinkled bills and spending her days walking the main street head down, clutching the photo of her son like a relic. The sheriff spoke with her whenever he could, offering quiet, practical sympathy that fell like stones in a well. She listened, nodded, and always asked the same question. Had they found anything yet? He would pause before answering, drawing in a slow breath before admitting they had not. She would close her eyes and nod again, as though she had known before she asked. Even in the homes of those who had searched for Jason, the talk slowly faded. It became something to be discussed only when the night was late, and the room was quiet enough that the wind outside sounded too much like a voice calling from the trees. Parents told their children not to stray off the marked paths. Rangers led tourists on the safer, easier trails, but the groups were smaller now. Some refused to hike at all. The story had taken root in the town's bones, a cautionary tale without a moral, only fear. By late November, frost had hardened the soil and coated the windows of the ranger station each morning. The sheriff's logbook had fewer entries. The phones rang less often. Deputies focused on traffic tickets and minor squabbles. The search notes were boxed and labeled in case they were needed again. But no one believed they would be. The map was finally taken down and folded away, the red X's and lines that had once felt so urgent, now creased and faded, tucked into a drawer with other old cases. It was not officially closed, but it might as well have been. The words "missing person" stayed on the books, a label that meant nothing and everything at once. In town, Christmas lights went up as usual, but there was less laughter in the decorating. The pastor at the church added a quiet prayer for Jason each Sunday, though by then even he struggled to find the right words. At the diner, his mother took her meals in silence, staring at the window and the mountains beyond which seemed to watch back with indifferent, unblinking calm. The sheriff checked on her whenever he could, but she had grown thinner and quieter, her grief settling around her like a shawl she could not remove. When the first real snow fell in December, it hushed the mountains, blanketing trails, filling hollows, and covering any sign of what might have happened in the autumn fog. The woods that had felt so open, so ready to yield their secrets, closed themselves completely. Paths became treacherous, and the ranger station's door was kept shut against the wind that howled down the valleys at night. Even the most determined searchers gave up. They would have to wait until spring. And in town, the story of Jason Mitchell settled into legend, half-remembered, told to strangers and tourists with sad eyes and shaking heads. 12 years passed before anyone mentioned Jason Mitchell's name with any hope of answers. Over those years, the town of Gatlinburg learned to live with the silence that settled around the ranger station, the gaps in the trail maps, the haunted look in the eyes of those who had known him well. His mother stayed in town for the first few years, but eventually she moved back to Knoxville, her hair going gray, her voice growing quiet, leaving behind a room over the old diner where she'd kept vigil for so long. Flyers were taken down or left to curl and yellow in the sun. Jason's disappearance became a cautionary tale told to tourists over campfires. Half-remembered details twisted in the telling until he was part ghost story, part local legend. In the summer of 2014, a family in Ohio cleaned out the garage of a grandfather who had passed away. Among boxes of winter clothes and tools sat a small silver digital camera from the early 2000s, the kind that ran on AA batteries and stored grainy images on tiny cards. The family powered it on out of curiosity and began scrolling through the old photos, laughing at the fashions and the dated resolution. Then the photos changed to landscapes they did not recognize. Pictures of foggy mountains, shots of tourists on a narrow trail, faces they did not know. Slowly, they realized these images were from a trip they had nearly forgotten, a vacation to the Smokies, 12 years earlier, that had ended abruptly when a park ranger had gone missing. They scrolled through shot after shot of the trip images that seemed unremarkable. There were tourists posing at trailheads, half-obscured signs warning of bears, and fog so thick it blurred faces. But as they reached the last image on the card, they fell silent. It showed the group in that famous clearing framed by the thick, colorless fog. In the center was Jason Mitchell, caught mid-turn, one arm lifted as if gesturing for someone to wait. His face was pale mouth, tight eyes wide and darting to something off frame. But it was the left edge of the photo that made the family exchange uneasy glances. Barely visible in the shadows between two trees was a man in camouflage. The figure was distant, but clear enough to see the shape of a face, eyes locked on Jason. The family debated for a week before sending the memory card to the local sheriff's department in Tennessee, explaining in a long apologetic letter that they had just now seen something that gave them chills. At first, the deputies treated it as another false lead, another call from someone remembering it wrong, but when they loaded the image onto the computer screen in the cramped office, the room fell quiet. They called the sheriff in from his lunch at the diner. He took one look, squinting at the blurry outline of Jason and the figure watching from the trees, and asked for the lights to be turned off so he could see better. He told the deputy to print a copy. Within days, the sheriff had reopened the case, pulling the old box of files from storage, brushing away the dust and flattened spider webs. He spread the maps out over the table again, pinning them at the corners with coffee mugs. The deputy read aloud from the old notes, trying to match the lines on the map to the route Jason's group had taken. This time, they had a reason to look again. They had something new, even if it was just one grainy photo, even if it was over a decade late. The sheriff ran a hand over his lined face and felt something he had not in years. He felt angry. News spread quickly through town. The local paper ran a small story with the headline, "Camera May Hold Clues in Ranger Disappearance," printing the photo with a red circle around the figure in the trees. Old volunteers who had searched the trails in 2002 called the sheriff to ask if they could help again. A few admitted they had never really stopped looking in their own way, checking side trails when they hiked, glancing into hollows and undercuts even years later. The family of Jason Mitchell was notified his mother receiving a carefully worded call from the sheriff himself. She sat in her apartment in Knoxville, clutching the phone with white knuckles, listening as he described the photo. She asked him to send it to her, and when she received the print, she spent hours staring at it at her small kitchen table, eyes wet but unblinking. Investigators called in experts from the State Bureau to analyze the photo. They boosted contrast and sharpened the edges, trying to make out more detail in the dark blur of the man in camouflage. They debated whether he was carrying something, argued about the shape of his face. The figure remained just clear enough to be haunting, but not enough to identify. Still, it was more than they had ever had. Deputies compared it to old suspect lists. They dug out arrest records from that year looking for anyone with hunting violations or trespassing charges. They knocked on doors, asking old-timers if they remembered a stranger camping in the area in 2002. The photo also reignited questions about the day Jason vanished. The tourists, who were still reachable, were called again, their numbers traced from old credit card receipts at the inn. Some refused to talk, embarrassed by how little they remembered clearly. A few agreed to interviews, their voices cracking over the phone as they described that heavy, silent fog, Jason's easy confidence, the way he had just walked away. One woman cried when asked if she remembered anyone in camouflage. She said she could not even remember her own husband's face clearly in that thick fog. Another insisted he did not see anyone, but admitted he had always felt watched, that the woods had seemed too quiet. In Gatlinburg, the old ranger station came alive with activity that had not been seen in years. The sheriff worked late nights under the buzzing fluorescent lights, pinning up the photo beside the old map, adding fresh notes in bold marker. Deputies reviewed every tip that had been dismissed back then, cross-referencing names and addresses. Volunteers dropped by to offer coffee or ask questions. Even some who had left town long ago called in with second-hand rumors. People argued about whether it proved Jason had been murdered or had run away from someone. Some whispered that the man in the photo was not from around there, that no one local would do such a thing in their own woods. The mood in town shifted. Where there had been resigned silence, there was now restless speculation. At the diner, people leaned in over plates of eggs and hash browns to share theories. At the church, the pastor added prayers for truth to the Sunday service. Jason's mother planned a visit back to Gatlinburg, telling the sheriff she wanted to walk that trail again if they would allow it. She wanted to see for herself the place where her son had turned around for a final photo, eyes wide with something no one had understood until now. The sheriff knew the moment he held the printed photograph that the investigation would no longer stay quietly in the back of the filing cabinet. He taped it to the wall of the ranger station above the dusty map with the old red X's. Deputies gathered around arms crossed, eyes narrowed, studying the blurred figure in camouflage partially hidden by trees. They argued about the shape of the man's face, whether it was a beard or just shadows. The sheriff listened to them for a while before raising a hand and telling them to stop guessing. He wanted lists of anyone in the county who had any violent charges or trespassing citations around 2002. He wanted old tips pulled from boxes. He wanted names and addresses even if they had moved away. He spoke with a low, controlled anger that settled the room. Files were brought out of storage in heavy plastic bins. The deputies set up a table near the window where the light was better, flipping through faded sheets with highlighters and pens in hand. They marked names that came up twice, people who had been in the park with hunting rifles without permits, men arrested for bar fights, those who had been seen camping too long on state land. One deputy called the DMV for old driver's license photos. Another called the state police to ask about any records from nearby counties. Phones rang with returning calls. The noise of printers and scanners filled the cramped room. Outside, rain fell in cold drizzles over the gray mountains. The sheriff drove out to Jason's mother's apartment in Knoxville to tell her in person. She had expected him, having seen the news coverage already, but she offered him tea anyway. They sat at her small kitchen table littered with envelopes and utility bills. She took out the photo and set it between them. He told her they were reopening everything. He said it as a promise. She listened in silence, eyes locked on that grainy image of her son in mid-turn with the shape in the woods behind him. She nodded slowly. She said only that she wanted them to find out who the man was. She wanted them to find the truth. Back in Gatlinburg, the story spread quickly. The local paper ran a front-page article with the blurry photo a red circle around the figure. The diner filled with the low hum of speculation as regulars argued about who it could have been. Some insisted it was just another hiker oblivious to the group. Others swore it proved Jason had been watched hunted even. One old man tapped his cane against the floor and said he remembered seeing a stranger in camouflage at the general store back then buying beer and jerky, not talking much. The sheriff sent a deputy to interview him, but his memory cracked under questions. He could not recall the face. The investigation pulled in old volunteers who had searched for Jason in 2002. Some were willing to walk the trails again, even after so many years, hoping to remember something they had missed. Deputies walked with them, asking them to point out every landmark. They stood in clearings where Jason's pack had been found, comparing angles with the photograph. They tried to guess the direction Jason had been facing the line of sight to where the man in camouflage stood. Rangers took new photos in winter light, showing the difference with bare branches. But time had changed, the forest trees growing thicker. Old logs rotted away. What had once been clear was now overgrown. Deputies interviewed the tourists who had been on that trip, tracking them through old inn receipts and credit card records. Some lived out of state now. Phone calls went long into the night, questions gentle at first, then more precise. Did anyone remember seeing someone off the trail? Did anyone hear Jason talking to a stranger before he left? Most admitted they remembered very little, just fog and the sound of boots on wet leaves. A woman cried softly when asked, saying she had tried for years not to think about that day. A man said he had nightmares sometimes about that clearing, about Jason walking away without looking back. The sheriff asked the state police for help with facial recognition software. The blurry figure in the photo was processed, cleaned up, enhanced, until the experts said they had reached the limit of what they could see. It showed a tall man with a hood or hat pulled low, part of his face in shadow. Nothing definitive. The image went into a database but returned no matches. The sheriff ordered local hunting license records from 2002, hoping to find anyone who fit the profile, but the results were overwhelming. Dozens of men had bought licenses that year. Cross-checking them with addresses and ages took weeks. Deputies marked out the ones who had moved or died. They drove miles down dirt roads to knock on doors, asking careful questions to men who had no idea why anyone was dredging up that fall so many years later. One deputy came back from an interview pale and quiet. He had spoken to a man who admitted he used to poach deer in the park around that time, camping off trail with no permit. But he insisted he had never seen Jason, had never heard of a guide going missing. He had a record for assault back in the late 90s, but nothing since. The sheriff listened without interrupting, then told the deputy to write it all down anyway. He said they would not rule out anyone. Not this time. As the weeks passed, the reopened investigation consumed the ranger station. Maps were taped up with new pins. Photos were printed and annotated. Names were written on whiteboards, crossed off, added again. The sheriff spent hours on the phone with Jason's mother, updating her gently, honestly telling her what they had tried and what they had failed to find. She thanked him each time, voice thin but steady. She said she wanted to know everything, even if it hurt. The town reacted with a strange energy, equal parts hope and dread. People felt old wounds opening again, grief surfacing in unexpected places. At the church, the pastor added special prayers for Jason's family, asking for light in the darkness. The diner stayed open late some nights, with the television tuned to news reports. Old friends of Jason who had moved away sent messages of support back to Gatlinburg, promising they had never forgotten. Deputies grew short-tempered and exhausted. One night the sheriff sent them home early, turning off the lights himself, standing alone in the ranger station with the old files spread before him. He ran his fingers over the photo one more time. He studied Jason's face, caught mid-turn, mouth open as if to call something back to the group. Behind him, in that frozen moment, a man stood watching. Winter hung on longer than expected in the Smoky Mountains, delaying any serious plan to revisit the trail where Jason Mitchell had last been seen. The sheriff insisted they wait for the thaw, refusing to risk injuries among searchers slipping on ice-slick rocks or hidden roots. While the town waited, deputies used the time to continue interviews, their notebooks filling with half-remembered conversations and confused recollections from people who were certain they had seen something that day but could not quite say what it was. The walls of the ranger station were plastered with maps, photos, and lists of names pins marking old campsites and places too remote to have been thoroughly checked in the original search. When the first warm days finally broke through the frost, the sheriff called his team together. They gathered around the long, scarred table with coffee steaming in mismatched mugs. He reminded them that the photograph had given them a clue, but no answers. He told them that every foot of that trail needed to be checked again. No assumptions, no shortcuts. They divided the area into manageable sectors and organized shifts so that even the most overgrown hollows and forgotten game trails would be covered. Volunteers trickled in too older now than during the first search, but no less determined. They brought their own packs and first aid kits, many wearing the same worn boots from 12 years before. On the first day of the new search, the forest greeted them with damp silence. Dead leaves matted the ground underfoot. Old logs lay mossy and half-collapsed, and low branches clawed at jackets and hats. Deputies moved slowly, heads, bent eyes scanning for anything that might have been overlooked. They found beer cans, rusted tin, and old burned-out campfire, but nothing that could be tied to Jason. At the clearing where his pack had been left, they paused. The spot had changed. A large tree had fallen in a storm years before, splitting the view and creating a jagged wall of gray wood. The undergrowth was thicker now, new saplings pushing up eager to claim the light. They circled the area for hours, retracing Jason's last known steps, trying to match angles from the photograph with the shifting landscape. Near dusk, one of the volunteers called out. He had found an old rusted tin coffee can wedged under a fallen log nearly hidden by dirt and leaves. Deputies gathered around as the sheriff bent and pried it free, his gloves scraping against cold metal. He lifted the lid slowly, revealing the contents. Inside lay Jason's old wristwatch, the cracked face stuck at 247 and a weathered driver's license folded around something else. It was a slip of paper, stained and brittle. The sheriff opened it with careful fingers. Written in uneven, hurried script were 2 words. "They made me." Silence fell over the group, the only sound the wind whispering through the trees. They bagged the items and marked the location precisely. The sheriff did not speak much on the way back, but his face was set like stone. At the ranger station, the evidence was photographed, cataloged, and locked away. He sat alone later with the note spread before him on the desk. He read the words over and over until they blurred. Deputies argued in hushed tones about what it meant. Some insisted it was a clear sign Jason had been forced away or killed. Others said it could be staged even by Jason himself. No one could explain why it had taken so many years to turn up or why it had been buried so carefully. News spread quickly through Gatlinburg. The diner filled with quiet conversation as regulars pored over copies of the local paper showing photos of the can and its contents. The pastor mentioned it in his sermon, praying for truth even if it hurt. Jason's mother received a call from the sheriff before the news broke. She sat on her apartment floor in Knoxville, holding the phone, listening to his voice explaining what they had found. She asked if it was his handwriting. The sheriff said it might be, but no one could be sure. She did not cry. She just thanked him for telling her first. In the following days, searchers focused on the area around the fallen log. Metal detectors swept the ground in slow, deliberate arcs. Dogs sniffed every hollow and pile of old leaves. Rangers probed the soil with long sticks, listening for hollow echoes that might reveal hidden shafts or collapsed dens. They found nothing else. The sheriff ordered them to keep looking. He refused to close down the operation even as days stretched into weeks without another clue. Volunteers came and went, schedules thinning as work and family called them home. Deputies took turns on shifts, their faces growing pale and pinched from fatigue. Deputies also revisited old interviews with the tourists from 2002. Armed with the new evidence, they asked if anyone remembered Jason writing anything down or acting afraid. Some insisted he had seemed relaxed that day, cracking jokes, pointing out rare plants. Others admitted they had not been paying much attention. One man swore Jason kept checking behind them as they walked, as if worried they were being followed. But when asked if he remembered seeing anyone in camouflage, he hesitated and said it had been foggy, that it could have been nothing. The sheriff marked it down anyway. The investigation spread further. They checked land records for old hunting leases, called the state wildlife officers for reports of illegal campsites, and dug up logs from park rangers who had since retired. A few old rangers remembered reports of trespassers around that time. One described finding a campsite deep off trail with camo tarps and the remains of meals, but no one had been there when they arrived. Another said he remembered seeing a man in a green jacket near a closed trail, but it had been shrugged off as just another hiker who wandered too far. The sheriff wrote it all down carefully. He insisted they not dismiss anything this time. At the end of each long day, the searchers returned to the ranger station muddy and scratched their clothes damp with sweat and rain. They slumped in old chairs' boots propped on rickety tables, drinking bad coffee in silence. The sheriff would go over the maps again, marking areas already covered, planning the next day's grid. Deputies would hand in notebooks filled with scrawled observations, receipts for gas, and batteries, lists of volunteers to thank. Outside, the woods closed in with the falling dark, quiet and watchful, as if holding its secrets close. The discovery of the rusted coffee can with Jason's watch and the chilling note reading, "They made me spread across Gatlinburg like fire catching dry grass." The sheriff's office received calls from reporters across the state. They declined most interviews, but confirmed the authenticity of the evidence. The local paper ran a second front-page story, this one darker in tone, headlined with the words, "Left Behind in the Woods." Conversations in diners and grocery stores turned grim. People remembered Jason's easy laugh and patient explanations on tours and struggled to reconcile that memory with the possibility he had been forced away at gunpoint or worse. Even those who had grown tired of the story years ago found themselves arguing in hushed voices over coffee and beer about who could have threatened him and why. Inside the ranger station, the mood was heavy but focused. Deputies reviewed the note and the placement of the can over and over. They considered whether it might have been staged or planted later. Forensics teams could not determine much given the years of weather and rust, but they confirmed the handwriting was consistent with Jason's. That meant he likely wrote it himself before vanishing. The phrase, "They made me," rattled everyone who read it. It suggested more than an accident or a desperate flight. It spoke of fear and of someone controlling his last moments. The sheriff, sleep-deprived and hoarse, told his team they could not let it become another unsolved rumor in the mountains. They began to dig deeper into Jason's life than they ever had before. They revisited old records of his finances, employment, and relationships. For years, people had assumed he was just a young guide who loved the park and had no enemies. But the deputies assigned to the case found bank statements showing several unusual cash withdrawals in the weeks before he vanished. The amounts were small enough to avoid notice for years, but suggested he was paying someone. When they found a final large withdrawal just days before the hike, they went quiet. It was too much to dismiss as groceries or rent. The sheriff instructed them to keep looking. Interviews with Jason's old friends turned up hints that he had seemed distracted in the months before the disappearance. A college buddy recalled Jason turning down a fishing trip, saying he could not leave town for a while. Another remembered Jason asking if he could borrow a few $100s, but refusing to explain why. When asked why none of this had come up in the first investigation, the friend had simply shrugged. He said no one had wanted to believe Jason was in trouble back then. They thought he had been stressed about work or helping his mom pay bills. The sheriff paid a visit to Jason's younger brother, who now lived a few hours away in a small apartment complex outside Chattanooga. He had been questioned before, years ago, and had always insisted he did not know anything. This time, the sheriff sat with him at the small formica table in the kitchen while the man's wife took their toddler to the park. The sheriff did not threaten him. He simply laid the photo of the coffee can, the watch, and the note on the table. He said they could not help Jason anymore, but they could at least tell the truth. The brother went quiet. He picked up the photo with shaking fingers and set it down again carefully. He admitted Jason had been scared that fall. He had asked him to help come up with some money. When pressed, the brother confessed that Jason had told him he owed $12,000 to a man he would not name. He said Jason had been evasive, refusing to say exactly why. He did not know if it was gambling or something else. He had given Jason $300 from his own savings. That was all he could spare. The rest, he guessed, Jason had scraped together any way he could. He had felt guilty for years, but had not told the police because he did not want his mother to know. The sheriff listened without interrupting. When the brother finished, he rubbed his face and asked if Jason had said anything about threats. The brother hesitated and then nodded slowly. Jason had said only that he was being watched. He had told him not to worry and that he would figure it out. The sheriff pressed for more, but the brother only shook his head. That was all he had. He had never seen the man Jason was paying. He did not even know a name. Back at the station, the sheriff relayed the confession to his deputies. They gathered around the table, notebooks open, pens tapping. They went through every arrest and known criminal in the area around 2002. One name kept coming up. A man with multiple assault charges suspected in loan sharking and extortion, though charges had never stuck. He had worked 2 construction jobs, hunted in the park illegally, and had been picked up once with an unregistered rifle. He had left town around 2004 and been arrested in Georgia for kidnapping charges unrelated to Jason. He had died in prison years later. The sheriff felt the weight of that dead man's name like an anchor. He asked if they had ever interviewed him during the original search. They had not. He had not been on any of the original suspect lists. The deputies fell silent. They knew what it meant. The sheriff slowly went to the old map on the wall and pressed a finger against the trails around the clearing. He told them to find any known campsites or hunting blinds this man might have used. He wanted to know if anyone else had ever heard him brag about anything, even drunk, in a bar. Deputies went out in pairs, knocking on doors in town and in the neighboring counties. They asked questions, carefully trying not to spook anyone. Some old-timers remembered the man as trouble. They said he had a temper and that he was not afraid of using fear to collect debts. One remembered him shooting at signs near the ranger station, laughing about how no one could stop him. Another recalled a rumor that he had once tied a man to a tree overnight to get him to pay up. None of it was enough for an arrest back then. But now it sounded like a death sentence delivered in the silent fog of a mountain trail. Inside the station, the sheriff wrote the man's name in block letters on the whiteboard. He circled it twice. The deputies watched him, their faces drawn and exhausted. They did not say anything. They did not have to. For the first time in years, they had something that felt like the truth. The investigation reached a slow, heavy culmination in early spring when the sheriff called a meeting at the ranger station. The air smelled of thawed mud and wet pine as deputies arrived in worn jackets still streaked with dirt from their last search shift. They gathered around the large map on the wall, now covered in new notes and photos, including the old search grids, the site of the coffee can discovery, and the blurred photo from the tourist's camera. The sheriff stood at the head of the table, his hands resting on a thick file as he looked at each of them one by one. He began by saying they would review everything they knew, not just to close the case, but to give Jason's family something more than questions. They started with the photo, the one that had reignited the entire investigation. A state forensic analyst had spent weeks enhancing it using modern software that had not existed in 2002. The figure in camouflage that had once been just a smear of shadow was now clearer, though still not crystal sharp. They could see a tall man with a heavy frame standing angled just behind a tree, his face partly obscured, but undeniably turned towards Jason. The deputies leaned in to study the printouts, noting the slight forward tilt of the man's posture, the watchfulness in the stance that suggested not an innocent bystander, but someone waiting or lurking. The sheriff explained that they had cross-referenced every hunting license from that year, every known trespasser, every man in the county with a violent record. They had interviewed people who barely remembered 2002, dredging up old rumors about a man with a violent temper who liked to hunt illegally in the park. He reminded them about the confession from Jason's brother, the quiet, desperate admission that Jason had been paying off a large debt to someone he refused to name out of fear. He read aloud the words from the note found in the rusted can. "They made me." The room was silent except for the rasp of paper under his fingers. They discussed the suspect who had surfaced late in the investigation. A man with multiple assault charges who had been known for extortion, who once boasted about leaving people tied up in the woods until they agreed to pay. Deputies shared what they had learned interviewing old drinking buddies who remembered the man bragging about getting paid to make people disappear. They discussed his arrest for kidnapping in Georgia years after Jason's disappearance, his eventual death in prison, his final silence. The sheriff admitted they would never get a confession, but he said they had enough to know. He said the town deserved to know. When the meeting broke up, the deputies left slowly, their boots thumping on the old wood floor. Outside the station, the mountains loomed green and dark under the shifting spring clouds. The sheriff sat at the table a moment longer, tracing the routes on the map with a finger remembering the early searches in the cold fog, the frustrated volunteers, the quiet tears of Jason's mother when she sat in this same room waiting for news. He closed the file with a soft, deliberate motion and stood up, shoulders stiff from hours hunched over notes. The sheriff called Jason's mother the next day. He asked if he could come to her apartment in Knoxville to talk. She said yes, and when he arrived, she offered him tea just as she always had. He declined gently and sat at the small table littered with newspaper clippings and old bills. He opened his folder and laid out the photograph, the enhanced version of the man in camouflage. He spoke slowly, carefully, explaining what they had found, the connections they had made, the evidence that pointed to someone who had threatened Jason, coerced him into debt, and likely forced him off that trail at gunpoint. He said the man was dead, but he wanted her to know what they had learned. Jason's mother sat silent for a long time, studying the photograph. She asked if they were sure, and the sheriff said as sure as they could be. He admitted it was not justice in a courtroom, but it was the truth. She nodded her head slowly, her eyes wet, but her mouth set in a firm line. She said she had always believed Jason did not just get lost, that someone had made sure he never came home. She thanked the sheriff for telling her for not pretending there was hope when there was not. She asked if she could keep the photograph, and he said yes. Back in Gatlinburg, the sheriff held a press conference outside the ranger station. Reporters gathered under the eaves as drizzle misted the air cameras, clicking as the sheriff read his statement. He described the evidence they had gathered, the connections to an old suspect, the note Jason had left behind. He did not mince words about the failure of the original investigation to dig deeply enough about the pain caused by the years of silence. He did not promise prosecutions, but he promised the town the truth. He said Jason Mitchell had not simply walked away, he had been forced under threat of violence into the woods and had never been seen again. The town reacted with a mixture of relief and grief. Some people expressed anger that it had taken so long to look at the debt, the threats, the man in camouflage seriously. Others thanked the sheriff and his team for refusing to let the case fade away, as so many had. At the diner, people read the paper in silence, heads bowed over their coffee. At the church, the pastor held a quiet memorial service for Jason, inviting anyone who wished to speak. Friends remembered his easy laugh, the way he taught kids the names of trees, the way he loved his mother so much he would have paid anything to keep her safe from worry. Jason's mother returned to Gatlinburg for the service. She sat in the front pew, holding the enhanced photo on her lap like a final relic. When it was her turn to speak, she rose slowly, her voice steady, despite the tremor in her hands. She thanked the people who had searched in the cold and fog all those years ago. She thanked the deputies who had knocked on doors and asked the hard questions. She thanked the sheriff for refusing to give up. She said she knew her son was gone, but she would not let his memory vanish. She wanted everyone to remember that he had been kind and patient and brave, and that no one should have to be afraid in these mountains he loved. As the crowd filed out, the sun broke through the clouds, lighting the wet grass and old gravestones with a sudden, harsh clarity. People paused on the steps, blinking against the light, hands in pockets, heads lowered. The sheriff stood with Jason's mother for a moment longer before helping her down the steps toward the waiting car. He promised her he would keep the file open in case anything new came up, but she just shook her head and said she understood. She said she was grateful to know. She said that even if there was no grave to visit, she finally knew where to lay her grief. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this story, please like and subscribe to the channel for more mysteries and true crime narratives. Share your thoughts about the plot in the comments and let us know where you are watching from. Your feedback helps us bring you more of the stories you want to hear.